Good morning to all. We are pleased to receive you to this debate with our invited speakers on the geopolitics of digital markets. And the main idea is to discuss how regulation is a key aspect of the strategies of different countries to the economic development, since it's widely acknowledged that digital markets are key for economic development. So the competitiveness of each country or the companies of each country in this field of digital markets became an important issue, how to stimulate competitiveness. And the question is, regulation would introduce limitations for competitiveness, or how regulation could stimulate competitiveness in this market. We have powerful countries and also Europe as a continent discussing the better strategies. Trump administration has signaled a position where our fierce competition, where regulation should be relaxed, particularly regarding AI markets. And also in Europe, there is a discussion whether a regulation should be also revised, whether there was not an excess of regulation that may hinder the development of digital markets in Europe. The Draghi report raised several questions regarding the abilities and capacities and potentials of Europe to explore these markets. And then the idea of this meeting is to have a clearer view, because there are consistent information both about Europe and about US regarding the geopolitical strategies in this market. So our idea is to have a clear view about European strategical position, and also about the US strategy and overview of regulation, so that we may think about the Brazilian context and what will be the better strategy for Brazil and for Latin America in general. This meeting is going to be recorded, and it will be the base for a meeting, in-person meeting in Brasilia, where we are going to gather important stakeholders for this debate in Brazil, to have a better reflection and discussion on what are the better ways for Brazil to regulate digital markets. We have here to debate with Alex Gray and with Jorge Padilla, Cristiane Albuquerque. She is a member of the ministry, an economist and member of the Ministry of Finance, who also is formulating a proposal for a draft bill for regulating digital market inspired by the UK model. And we have also Cesar Mato, who is an economist, former commissioner of the Brazilian Antitrust Authority, and an advisor of the Chamber of Deputies, who was involved in the House of Deputies proposal for regulation of digital markets. So I'm sure that this will be a rich opportunity for have these clarifications and an initial discussion of the European and the US context in order to think about the Brazilian context. For the European landscape, we have here, we are very pleased and honored to have Jorge Padilla, who is a specialist in this debate. He's president of Compass Lexecon in Europe, and is involved and is an important stakeholder in the European debate about industrial policy and competition in the European Union. And then after a talk by Jorge Padilla, we will hear Alex Gray, who is CEO of the American Global Strategies, also a specialist in antitrust, and who is also involved in the debate of the US policy regarding digital markets. So, without further ado, I would like then to pass the floor to Jorge Padilla. Jorge, it's really an honor and a great pleasure to have this opportunity to hear your perspective on the European landscape on the regulation of digital markets.
Well, thank you so much, Juliano. I hope that you can hear me well.
Yeah, it's
Very
perfect.
good. So thank you again for the opportunity. This is really a very timely, well, it's a very important topic, but it's also a very timely discussion because I think that, as we all know, things are moving and the regulatory debate has become, so in some sense, a trade debate, and as a result, a growth debate. And there is a lot of at stake, both for Europe, for many other parts of the world, for the global economy. Let me start by repeating something, Juliano, that you mentioned, which is that all countries, and whether they are developed or developing, really stand to benefit from the digitization of their economies. And that means that digital platforms, which act as intermediaries between business users and domestic users, play a key role in our modern economies. They're critical. And they're critical both, as I said, in developed countries, but also in developing economies. And that is especially true for some of the global platforms like Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft, but also for a number of regional platforms, whether they are Chinese like Alibaba or Tencent, or Mercado Libre, for example, in many places in South America. Now, the digitization process, however, faces some risks, and the main risk is that it may be delayed, or its benefits may be more limited because of some of the characteristics of these digital markets. And you all know these characteristics because they have been repeated many times. There are network effects, there are economies of scale and scope, two-sided markets or multi-sided markets, low marginal cost but very large fixed costs, and significant economies of scale and scope also regarding data, and data acting potentially as a barrier to entry. So on the one hand, the digitization of the economies is critical. On the other hand, there are potential threats as to how fast that process can go on, and the extent to which the benefits that are associated with that process will be widely distributed and will spur growth in our economies. And it is because of this that in a number of jurisdictions, you have seen initiatives, both legislative and regulatory, aiming to address potential concerns of market entrenchment, market dominance, gatekeeper positions, etc., in order to achieve basically a number of things. One, fundamentally, that any positions of market power that emerge in these markets as a result of the features that I mentioned before are transient, that these markets become more contestable. And secondly, the second objective has been to ensure that the all-powerful digital platforms do not abuse their position, and their actions don't impinge on the rights of citizens, whether as consumers, or whether as voters, or whether as parents, or in general as individuals. And I think that, as I said, that has triggered both regulatory, antitrust action, and legislative action. And in Europe, we have had a bit of the three. In Europe, initially, the goal of ensuring that these digital markets remain competitive, contestable, and that the innovation that was produced in these markets was to the benefit of all, was try to be protected by the antitrust authorities, and in particular the European Commission. So the European Commission and its competition arm, DG Comp, was in a sense trying to ensure, as I mentioned before, that there was enough competition and there was enough innovation, so that these markets became active, not dominated, and consumers could benefit from them. Eventually, however, the European Commission and other competition authorities in Europe got frustrated by what they thought was the ineffective use of antitrust as a disciplinary tool and as an industrial policy tool. The antitrust cases lasted for very long, many years, sometimes decades. The remedies that the European Commission was able to impose on these large digital platforms were limited, oftentimes exclusively cease and desist. The ability that the agencies, such as the European Commission and other European competition authorities, had to affect or modify the business models of the digital platforms was also very limited. So the idea that ex post intervention was going to be sufficient to, in a sense, move these markets in the right direction proved disappointing. And as a result of that, the legislator, and the executive, in the European case, the European Council and the European Parliament, but also in some member states, the governments and their legislatures, considered that perhaps it was time to do something different and to adopt a different instrument that could help control the conduct of these digital platforms, to ensure that indeed the digitalization of the economy was successful. The debate initially in Europe was, okay, why don't we try to do something that is not entirely different from the competition policy approach that we have adopted, that is kind of ex ante and ex post. It's not pure ex post enforcement like antitrust, like the enforcement of abuse of dominance legislation, but it's not ex ante regulation. It's more flexible. And the idea was to try to implement in Europe the so-called market investigation tool that has been used for several decades in the United Kingdom. And this tool doesn't try to look for or doesn't investigate particular conduct, and doesn't regard that conduct quasi-criminal offense, like it is the case under abuse of dominance, Article 102. It looks at impediments, structural impediments or behavioral impediments in the way that a market works. And it tries to address those directly by imposing remedies that could be behavioral or structural, but without accusing anyone of any abuse or misconduct. So this is a tool that is not quasi-criminal like the antitrust laws, and as such, it involves a much faster process. I mean, of course, there is a lot of dialogue, and there are rights of defense on the part of those companies that are part of the market investigation. But it is the process is less straitjacketed, is more flexible. There are time limits, and there is a much more conversational process, or a process of dialogue between the investigative unit or agency and the participants in the discussion. And some remedies are not directed to the conduct of a particular company in the market or another, but they are remedies that apply to the market itself. And this had very wide support on the part of practitioners, lawyers, economists, and as I said, legislators and governments. Now, the difficulty with this tool at the European level is that, for reasons that are definitely outside my area of expertise, as I am simply an economist, introducing this tool in the portfolio of tools available to the European Commission would have required apparently the unanimity of all member states, and there were serious doubts that some member states, which are, in a sense, very close to some of the companies that could have been affected by this tool, were going to be in favor. As a result of that, the Commission moved in a different direction. It moved in a different direction with a different legal basis, which was not the promotion of competition. Was, on the contrary, this new legal basis was the promotion of the single market, the European single market, the harmonization of regulation within the single legal market. And for that, it had to adopt, or it was compelled to adopt, an ex-ante regulatory approach. So even if initially the idea was to substitute ex-post antitrust enforcement with a hybrid instrument like the market investigation tool that I was referring to before, eventually we settled in Europe in this ex-ante regulatory approach. And as you know, this is the Digital Markets Act. For reasons, again, that escape, that are go beyond my area of expertise, adopting an ex-ante regulation of the sorts when aimed to protect and enhance the single market doesn't require unanimity. Only a qualified majority of member states need to support it, and therefore this was easier to adopt than the market investigation tool. And I'm saying this because, to some extent, sometimes I'm asked, to what extent the Digital Markets Act and the ex-ante approach that is embodied in that act is the best possible response to the alleged failure of the ex-post antitrust enforcement. And my answer is, don't draw that conclusion from the choice made in Europe, because to a large extent, that choice was driven by institutional considerations that have nothing to do with the effectiveness of the instrument. The ex-ante approach, in fact, as an instrument, is very powerful, but it has some problems. It's very powerful because it establishes a set of obligations for a number of companies, the so-called gatekeepers. And these obligations, many of them are kind of, self-enforcing. They are clear-cut and do not require a lot of specification. But those that require specification, they can be specified through a process of dialogue with the gatekeepers, with the regulated companies, although it's not really a symmetric process of discussion. There is an element of coercion if the Commission is not persuaded that the remedies or the actions provided by the specifications suggested by the gatekeepers is sufficient to achieve the goals of the act. It can act to impose or to compel certain actions. But it's very powerful in the sense that this is a set of obligations. Some of them, as I said, self-defined, self-enforcing. The other ones as a result of dialogue. And there is little else that requires. You don't need to define markets. You don't need to do effects-based analysis. You don't need to look at ex-post effects. The conducts in question are, in a sense, problematic per se, and the remedies that go well beyond cease and desist are seeking to resolve those problems with what was expected at the time, a very limited litigation or disputes. All powerful but problematic or difficult because all this is imposed ex ante. So you define the gatekeepers as of a given date, and you tell them, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, do this, do that, and these are all clear-cut mandates. But of course, those platforms operate in a very dynamic environment. Conditions of competition change over time. It's true that you don't see constant entry or exit, but you see entry and exit. You see convergence of different activities. You see that many of these platforms compete simultaneously at various dimensions. And while they may be relatively weak in one market, the fact that they are particularly strong in another may allow them then to dispute or contest the position of the other gatekeeper or the gatekeeper in an adjacent market. And so all these complications, all these dynamics, in a sense, has to be ignored in an ex-ante approach, because by definition, the ex-ante approach doesn't look at how the market evolves. It presumes that the market or certain types of conduct are going to be negative for a long period of time, at least until the gatekeeper classification is revised or the obligations are reconsidered. But for a set period of time, these obligations remain unchanged. And therefore, this approach requires that the legislator, the regulator, the government anticipates more or less accurately that the problems that not only exist at a given point in time, but they are likely to remain, and finds the remedies that is imposing are not going to affect the way that the market works, and actually end up, in an unintended way, preventing the sort of competitive dynamics that in fact it is presumed that is not going to exist. So to some extent, what I'm trying to say is that the ex-ante approach may be self-perpetuating, because the very ex-ante regulations that are meant to promote contestability, what they end up doing is preventing contestability, so that they remain necessary as time goes by. So there are pros with this ex-ante approach, and there are some concerns about it. In particular, I think that there are the following concerns. One concern, which is a concern that we Europeans have about the Digital Markets Act and other similar ex-ante regulation in the digital sector, is that it may prevent innovation, that it may actually make innovation by gatekeepers much more complicated, because every innovation may be seen with suspicion as to not trying to increase the size of the pie, but actually retain the pie in the hands of the gatekeeper. That the concern is also about the extent to which these interventions may chill innovation by newcomers. And I think that not so much in connection with the DMA, which is relatively recent, but if we think about the effects of the data protection regulation, the so-called GDPR, I think that there is a growing consensus that GDPR, instead of promoting contestability, has actually helped the large incumbents to retain a competitive advantage, given that the very onerous requirements that it imposes on companies are very difficult to deal with for the small companies. And so there is a concern that these ex-ante regulations may end up freezing innovation. And then there is a more recent concern that doesn't come from Europe, comes from other parts of the world, and especially the US, which is that these regulations have or are targeted to American companies, to non-European companies, and therefore constitute a tax, a distortionary tax for international trade, a tax on American companies that distorts the balance of trade and harms not only these American companies, but also the American company as a whole. And that's where these digital market regulation, or why the digital market regulation has become now, in a sense, part of the trade debate. But before I move there, let me tell you that other jurisdictions are adopting different approaches, as very well explained by Anu Bradford in her seminal book, Digital Empires. The approach followed in Europe, which is very much centered on the idea of fairness to consumers and fairness and to the small and medium enterprises that rely on these digital platforms to operate in the digital economy. In opposition to that rights-based approach, you have different approaches in the US and in China. The US has, I think that, or relies fundamentally or maintains its exposed antitrust enforcement approach to ensure the contestability and fairness of these markets, the competitiveness of these markets, and is much more skeptical about the use of regulation. As you all know, there are cases now run by the Department of Justice against Google, by the Federal Trade Commission against Meta. There are also cases running against Apple. These are all antitrust cases that where complaints have been filed to courts, and they are being litigated there. Google has been found by judges to have infringed a dominant position in search. More recently, there is another ruling concerning Google's activities in the ad tech markets. And at this point in time, there are discussions as to which are the appropriate remedies, which may involve divestitures. Something that the European legislator, the European regulator, and the European Commission have thus far not considered structural remedies of the sort. Everything, whether that was pursued both from an antitrust perspective or using the Digital Markets Act, has been more behavioral or quasi-structural in the sense of regulating conditions of access, but not changes in property structure or ownership structure. In the US, you see proposals for regulation that are being discussed in Congress, but they don't seem to, at this stage, and speaking under the control of Alex, to have got that much traction. So it seems at this stage that the US is going to rely fundamentally on its exposed antitrust tools in order to ensure that the behavior of critical platforms in these markets that are prone to concentration doesn't stop innovation and doesn't prevent the digitization of the economy and doesn't put a brake to innovation. In China, you have a completely different approach. It combines antitrust. It combines also regulation. It relies a lot in antitrust, but not only. And the difference fundamentally is that the goals are much more expansive than those of in Europe or in the US. And the US exposed antitrust enforcement seeks to make sure that the unilateral conduct or the collective conduct of the main digital platforms doesn't prevent competition, in the firm belief that competition enhances innovation. In Europe, the idea is, we don't put that much trust on exposed intervention, but we think that our ex-ante rules are aimed at exclusively promoting contestability in these markets, ensuring that these markets remain fair to all of its participants. The Chinese approach is much more macroeconomic, and the idea is that ultimately the goal is to make sure that the Chinese economy, that China plays a key role in the what they see as the international or global race for with respect to these technologies. So the race in artificial intelligence, the race in and the use of digital platforms, the race also in the future in quantum computers. So their approach is characterized by centralized enforcement, top-down directives from central authorities, but much more ad hoc than the initiative that is embodied in the Digital Markets Act. An approach that is integrated with industrial policy, with the ideas of technological self-reliance and possibly technological dominance in the world, and an approach that it's adjusted dynamically, and you could say in a very ad hoc way, in order to match the economic and political objectives of the Chinese government at each point in time. There are other approaches out there, some that sit somewhat in between. I'm not going to elaborate on them for reasons of time, but you have the UK approach, which is kind of an ex ante approach, similar in many respects to the approach of the European Commission, the Digital Markets Act, but that is much less prescriptive, much more tailored to the particular case of each platform, and much more based on a process of consensus with each of the platforms, as opposed to mandatory regulation or mandatory conditions. And Brazil is one of the areas where this digital regulation is being considered. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. There is a mixture, different combinations of ex ante or ex post approaches. But I would like to conclude by going back to the trade debate. These different approaches to the regulation of digital markets in the current geopolitical context have become extremely controversial, and it has been interpreted by many as the using regulation as a means to obtain competitive advantage in a global race for technological dominance. For years in Europe, we talked about the Brussels effect, a notion also introduced by Anno Bradford in another famous book. And we were kind of proud of that. We are devising these regulations like GDPR that then many in the world consider that are very helpful. And so the protections that we are extending to European consumers will be extended to consumers around the world. At this point in time, on the contrary, we're starting to think maybe this Brussels effect, instead of being helpful, is totally unhelpful, and is actually impeding our companies to compete effectively in the global marketplace. And guess what? What are we doing regulating industries where our companies are actually lagging behind, and possibly making the life of our own companies very complicated? The Brussels effect has been seen in both China and the US as hostile, as attempts by the Europeans to achieve through regulation what they are unable to achieve in the marketplace, to promote their companies at the expense of US and Chinese companies. And critically, very recently, I think that this has been made even more manifest and obvious in the way in which the current US administration has reacted to, or is reacting to, the very existence of the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, and all these compendium of regulations that Europe has been introducing. They are seen, as I mentioned before, as a tax. And to some extent, they are considered as meriting retaliatory tariffs. So the fight, the current trade war, if we can call it like that, is not being only about tariff instruments. It's also about what we economists call behind the barrier, behind the border barriers of trade. And in this case, regulation. This introduces a new dimension when considering in which direction the DMA and the use of ex-ante regulation is going to go. And not surprisingly, the Europeans and the European Commission is considering whether this was a clever move. Of course, in public discussion, that's not going to be mentioned because I think that would weaken its negotiating position. But the extent to which this is a helpful development or has been a failed attempt. The hope that the DMA was going to end up a litigation, it was going to lead to the quick and fast implementation of remedies has failed. And I think that you see now, again, the Commission considering whether it should strengthen its traditional ex post enforcement antitrust tools. There is a discussion about new guidelines for the enforcement of exclusionary abuses. And I guess that you wouldn't be surprised if I tell you that one of the reasons why maybe the Commission is considering to reinvigorate the reinvigoration of Article 102 is that it may have realized that the ex-ante regulatory approach was not or is not going to deliver what was expected, and what's more, is producing a backlash in the global arena that may prove very detrimental. So let me stop here. I think that there are many other issues that we could debate, but I guess that we can do that later in the Q&A. So thank you very much, Juliano. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I will give the floor to Alex Gray now, so that we leave then more 30 minutes or more, if you can stay, because your inputs were really interesting, Jorge, and for a debate. So I will leave room for Alex Gray, and then after that, we may debate. I have several questions already. I'm sure Cristiane and Cesar also have questions to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today. And it's great and a little bit daunting to follow Jorge, because he clearly has such an extraordinary command of these issues. And I should say, just to start with, it's very kind to be introduced as an antitrust expert. I don't pretend to be an antitrust expert, and I don't pretend to be an expert on antitrust law. What I do sometimes pretend to do is have a little bit of knowledge of how the current U.S. administration thinks about geopolitics, the politics of technology, and international relations more generally. And I was privileged to serve all 4 years of President Trump's first term in the White House, at both the National Economic Council and the National Security Council, and was able to glean some insights, I think, into the current environment that we're dealing with in 2025, based on the experiences of those 4 years, and how I think the United States is now thinking about the confluence of technology policy, geopolitics, technology policy, competition policy, and trade policy, how it's all coming together. So let me start with kind of a reflection on where we are. I think the most important thing to understand is we're thinking about the current environment, is that in the discussion between the United States and Europe, I think the Vice President, J.D. Vance, gave what I know. I was there, so I saw firsthand. It was not the most well-received speech on the current state of U.S.-European relations, at least by the people in the room at the Munich Security Conference. But it reflects a deeply held view, not just in the administration, but a deeply held view by many, many Americans about what I would call the values gap between the United States and Europe. And this is kind of a fundamental divergence over the last maybe 20, 30 years in how the US and Europe, both the European Union bureaucracy, but also probably Western Europe politically as a broader concept, view key issues. And this is relevant for our conversation here today, because when you think about the things that the vice president was listing as grievances of the United States, one of the things that he touched on, which is an extension of an ongoing debate in the U.S. domestic political context, is what we would call censorship. And obviously there are different understandings of that word, but in the U.S. political context, the approach to competition policy and technology policy by the European Union is coming to be seen as censorious. It's coming to be seen as an attempt to crack down on the success of American tech companies and the ability of American tech to speak freely, to operate freely, and it's coming to be seen as an attack on kind of a fundamental series of American values. And I think the concern that I see is twofold. The values debate, and we see this between the US and Europe in a number of different ways, the more technology policy becomes associated with this broader divergence in political values between the US and the EU, that becomes a fundamental challenge for a healthy relationship going forward. The second is the United States, from a geopolitical perspective, our number one geopolitical organizing principle. I think this will be true. This was true under President Trump's first term. It was true under President Biden. And I believe it's going to be true under President Trump and whoever his successor is in 3.5 years, is the People's Republic of China. And I think it's critical for our friends in Europe and our friends in Brazil to see the approach that we're taking to technology policy as directly tied to America's concerns about the rise of China and the malign threat that China poses to U.S. core strategic interests. So let's unpack that a little bit. When the United States, and this reflects President Trump's view, and I can attest to this firsthand, when President Trump thinks about American technology and American tech companies, the president sees them as not just an engine of economic growth, but he sees them as national champions. And this is a view that is increasingly prevalent across the United States, across both parties and across kind of a wide array of the political spectrum in Washington. And I would summarize it as this. If you want to have the ability to compete with China long term, if you want to have the capacity to innovate, to stay on the cutting edge of a competition that's going to be defined by technology, by access to technology, by innovation, by the ability both in the economic side, but also in the military side, in that dual use space between the two, if you want to dominate that space and therefore likely dominate the competition between the US and China over the next 100 years, you must have the most innovative tech sector. And so when the president thinks about our tech sector as a national champion, he is directly thinking about it in the context of this sector is going to determine his legacy. And this is a president who is very personalized. He personalizes relations between leaders, between countries, between companies. It is going to directly impact his legacy as leading the US toward a more confrontational approach to China if the US has a dynamic tech sector. So when we see things coming out of the European Union that directly, when we see direct challenges, explicit, stated by senior European officials who say that this is about targeting the DMA, that DST, that similar pieces of legislation are about targeting American tech companies. They're not about targeting European competitors. That hits two very hot button American issues. It hits the values discussion that J.D. Vance has elucidated very clearly, and it hits the China competition concerns that animate so much of the policy that's coming out of Washington, I would argue on a bipartisan basis. I think it's important to also understand as we think about this that President Trump, if you look at the very, I think, not sufficiently appreciated social media post that he did shortly after his Liberation Day tariffs, he made a comment that was kind of buried in the text. And he said, the negotiations that we're going to have on resolving these tariffs are going to be conversations that are what he called a one-stop shop. And I think that did not gain the appreciation and the nuance that it deserved. What the president means by that, in my interpretation, having worked for him and watched him deal with things like DST last time, is he does not view trade negotiations as a trade negotiation in the sense that maybe some of us associate it from previous American administrations. So this will not be a discussion as he's thinking about this across the globe. This will not be a discussion that's confined to simply what are your tariff rates? What is your approach to American dairy? What's your approach to American softwood lumber? Autos. This is going to be a much more comprehensive set of discussions, and part of that series of discussions is going to include technology policy. I saw this firsthand when President Trump dealt with President Macron in France over the digital services tax in 2019-2020. And as has been publicly reported, this led to some very significant tariff retaliation threats by the Americans before the DST was dropped. And I think the challenge that we're facing right now is President Trump is likely, I think almost assuredly likely, to associate, to directly apply concerns about technology policy, DMA, DST, competition regulation to trade negotiations. So I think you're going to see a situation where the president is going to sit down and have conversations with his counterparts around the world, and he's going to say, how are you treating American national champions in the technology space? I think he's going to directly say that constitutes a non-tariff barrier. If you are cracking down, if you're the EU and you're defining gatekeepers for DMA purposes as all American companies, essentially, he's going to view that as a non-tariff barrier, the same way that he would view, Japan having varying standards for American agriculture versus Japanese agriculture. I think you're going to. So my point here is, I think that because of the geopolitical concerns we have and the absolutely essential nature from a U.S. perspective of maintaining technology dominance from a U.S.-China competition standpoint, plus the values argument that's animating domestic politics here around technology policy, I think when you combine all that, plus the president's unique style of negotiation, you're going to see technology policy and antitrust and competition policy put on the very forefront of the trade negotiation agenda as we try and wind down this trade war. I would say just a couple things, because I think it's probably more useful to take questions and to have a dialogue. We think about Brazil, and I think this is important. I've been privileged to go to Brazil a couple times this year and to have some good conversations with senior leadership in your government. I think that there is a unique opportunity for the U.S. and Brazil to work collaboratively on a number of areas of interest in the hemisphere and more broadly. I think as Brazil is looking at various models for technology regulation, I would highly encourage a serious and sophisticated think through of how onerous regulation like the DMA in the EU context has negatively affected the US-EU relationship. And again, I would bring this back to the kind of very critical, the inputs that are animating the way the United States is thinking about this. So obviously, as I said, the United States, under most presidents, fights for its companies. But because of the importance of our technology companies in the context of winning what is seen as an existential competition with the Chinese Communist Party, there is a level of animation by US policymakers around standing up for tech that is unprecedented. And it has changed dramatically in even just a few years. Even since I came into the White House in 2017, the level of focus and attention, bipartisan in Washington, around you may not agree with every policy that US tech undertakes. You may not agree with every policy US tech undertakes in a domestic American political context. But from a geopolitical standpoint, I think there is almost universal agreement across both parties, at least at the serious policymaking level, that standing up in the context of onerous and over-regulated antitrust and competition approaches globally for our tech champions has real geopolitical implications that can't be ignored. And so I think, to the president's point about a one-stop shop, where he's going to incorporate things beyond just traditional trade discussions into how he winds down tariff rates, how he comes to trade deals. The president will have a very clear sense when he sits down with leaders in Brazil, with President Lula, with others. He will have a very clear sense of how Brazil is thinking about competition, tech, and antitrust policy. I'll just give you one example that I think should illustrate that. When the president goes into a meeting with a foreign leader, he has a note card. It's actually one of these note cards. It says National Security Council on the top. And it will list, in addition to having the name of the world leaders, some key stats, how do you address he or she, excuse me. The first thing on the top of the card will be key issues in the relationship. Basically, what has that country done in the bilateral relationship that the U.S. has a concern with? It's the number one thing on the card. And I can tell you from having a number of friends who are still at the National Security Council writing these cards, almost without exception, in his interactions over the last 3 months, how a country is treating American tech champions, our largest companies by far, makes the top of the note card every time. Then you have the trade deficit. Then you have the percentage of defense, percentage of GDP that country is spending on defense. Those are the three things that the president of the United States is looking at most when he goes to interact with his foreign counterparts. And I think as we want to have a global ecosystem that's lifting living standards, that's raising development standards, that's promoting a inclusive economy, things I know that are hugely impactful in Brazilian political culture. Obviously, having a relationship with the United States economically and geopolitically that's driven by mutual interests and mutual respect, that's going to be key. And so I would just say in that context, thinking about where the American pressure points are, what is pushing our leaders to take certain positions is really important. And the advocacy for American tech, for the reasons I've laid out, is something that I think is helpful for Brazilian interlocutors to understand. And the EU context, I hope, can serve as a warning for how a misguided approach to that to competition policy and regulatory policy can have a real negative impact on the relationship writ large, far outside of just a narrow conception of technology policy. This has become so much larger because for the reasons I laid out. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'd love to have questions and have a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that we had very interesting contributions. Jorge Padilla focused more on the regulation landscape and raised some concerns about the regulation, while you have invested more time in discussing geopolitical strategies and effectively what is the Trump approach to the issues regarding digitalization, and the key approach is to use U.S. power in the trade, in the global trade, to push forward trade negotiations to protect American champions. So I have to begin our discussion. I have two questions, one for Jorge, another to Alex. To Jorge, actually, I'm going to bring a question made by Victor Fernandez, who would be here, but he couldn't join, unfortunately. But he would like, Victor Fernandez is presently CADES, the antitrust authority. He is a commissioner. and he would like to know better whether you see already some negative effects of the DMA in Europe. And I think that this matches your concerns regarding the lack of flexibility of ex-ante regulation before the dynamics of the digital economy. And I would like just to add that, considering that we have Cristiane Albuquerque here, if there are some negative effects presently by the DMA, or that you can already predict by the enforcement of the DMA, would that those negative effects be avoided if the model were the UK approach, where you have the antitrust authority bringing those ex-ante rules instead of just having the legislation stating those rules? That's my question to Jorge. And to Alex, I would like to know from your perspective how Trump is going to handle DOJ and FTC in his strategy for trade negotiation with his agenda, because the first thing that a country within this pressure by Trump would say, I would say, well, you are demanding to treat well your big tech champions, but at your home you are imposing divestitures. Not you, of course. These agencies are imposing strong divestitures to Google. To now there is this process against Meta. So how can he handle and make this agenda compatible with his geopolitical interests? Because these are independent agents. How can he fix things at home before imposing this agenda?
So maybe should I start, Juliano?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I think that to some extent, if I may, the question reminds me of this famous sentence that I think is attributed to former Prime Minister in China, Zhou Enlai, who was asked at one point in 1970, I guess by Kissinger, was asked, "What do you think about the French Revolution and or the French what is happening in France?" Possibly he was thinking about May 1968. But apparently the answer was interpreted as an answer regarding the events in 1789, and the answer was, "It's a little bit too early to tell," and and I think that it's a little bit too early to tell whether the DMA is being successful. Now, I think that there are certain things that, in my opinion, where in certain dimensions something has happened, and I think that is positive. For example, some of the gatekeepers, I think, that have adopted certain practices that, in my opinion, are consumer welfare increasing. I'm going to refer to a platform that is not American, is the European platform that is treated as a gatekeeper, Booking. I think that the Booking's response to the DMA, eliminating some of the MFN clauses that characterize the platform, I think that are pro-competitive, and I think that they are welcomed by European industry and are likely to have positive effects. And I think that there are other such responses to the DMA that are very positive. But I think that to a large extent, the main problem with the DMA is that is being litigated. That there is dissatisfaction both by the gatekeepers about what is being requested and by the number of other companies about what the gatekeepers are proposing. And this is leading to litigation, is leading to fines, is leading to all sorts of things that we thought that perhaps we would avoid with the DMA, and that the sort of litigation cost or transaction costs that we expected to avoid, and that was allegedly one of the advantages of the ex-ante approach. The UK approach, which is more negotiated, perhaps would feature better. It's very unclear. That's even earlier to say, because it's really just starting. But I really don't know. I mean, it depends on at one point the negotiations between the regulator and the regulated, become sour, and what happens at that point, and how the British authorities respond to that. One final word before I stop and we move to Alex. I think that it is important for non-Europeans and especially for Americans to understand that the demand for the DMA was to a large extent driven by U.S. firms. So if you look at the cases the cases involving U.S. tech companies since year 2000 in the Microsoft case, and I was working for Microsoft at the time, they have been driven by complaints by U.S. firms. Those at the time was Real Networks, it was Sun Microsystems. Some people allege that the company X in the commission decision was IBM. And very recently, when you see demands for intervention against Meta and Apple and Google, sometimes come from lesser US companies and not European companies. And sometimes they are the big techs themselves who try to persuade the commission to act against the other big tech. Now, I don't think that that's going to change the position of the administration regarding this, but it may change the position of the European governments and the European Commission about the risks that this regulation brings to European companies, when in fact the main beneficiaries are not even the European companies. So I think that is something that to keep in mind, which is often neglected in these debates.
Thank you, Jorge. Actually, you raised a very interesting point about not actually. It's too early to evaluate the economic impacts, but we have already, you have already observed an impact on legal certainty because it brought litigation. And this is a concern that we have in Brazil because actually antitrust impositions by the antitrust authorities usually lead to litigation in Brazil. And the ex-ante regulation would be a solution for uncertainty regarding time, if the time is effective to intervene within the digital markets. And so if the regulation brings more litigation, then this is a problem about the time of the intervention. So you may reduce time in the administration, but then you have more time for litigation and uncertainty in the judiciary. I think this is an important point to raise for us to have concern about it.
Juliano, one extra word. I think that there is another thing that we are realizing, and this is that I'm not sure that everybody would agree, but my perspective is that one thing that we have learned is that the European Commission doesn't have the staff needed to move such an ambitious body of regulation at speed. And I think that whoever contemplates going in this direction needs to understand that this regulation is costly to enforce and requires lots of resources. And I think that we underestimated that.
I see. That's important also because, for instance, in the Minister of Finance, later Cristiane may add on that, there is a proposal of the creation of a digital unit at CADE, the Brazilian Antitrust Authority. Then we have to be aware of that. But will there be enough resources to structure this digital unity to be effective? Because actually it demands a lot of energy and staff to move forward with the definition of ex-ante rules that will not hinder. It will promote the protection of consumer rights, but will not hinder the development of technology. These are very good points to reflect upon. So, Alex, my challenge to Trump, how would you react to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I see that the apparent inconsistency But I actually think from a Trump administration standpoint, they don't see a inconsistency at all. And I think what they would tell you is, of course, we're going, and by the way, as you said earlier, a lot of these antitrust actions were initiated by the previous administration. I think it still remains to be clear which are going to be continued and which are going to be modified and which are going to be dropped under the Trump administration. But let's even take that some of these may continue. I think that the Trump administration would say, well, of course, in the domestic legal context, we have every right to regulate our own domestic companies, and we have every right to do that. Now, I disagree with most of, if not all, of these actions on grounds of substance. And I think that they not only is the substance wrong from a domestic context, I also think that it has the effect of damaging our competitiveness long term. I think what the Trump administration will say, though, is even if they made the decision to pursue some version of domestic antitrust legislation or regulatory action, that is a very different situation from a foreign government targeting American tech companies. And I think of the EU DMA particularly for what they would argue are reasons of economic advantage. And this is what I think is really key. The Trump administration views the way in which the EU has gone after American tech champions, not just simply as a regulatory action. It is seen as an attempt to gain advantage. And I would point to comments by the French finance minister saying, well, of course, this is not going to target French companies. Of course, this is going to only target the American, quote unquote, gatekeepers. You can find numerous quotes from senior Europeans talking about this as an us versus America dynamic. And so the Trump administration, I think, understandably sees this as an aggressive, unnecessary economic assault on the global engine of technology innovation, but from a European perspective, targeting Europe's competitors economically. And I think that is the concern, and how the Trump folks would contrast that as being a very different situation from a sovereign government undertaking domestic regulation, even though I may personally find some of that regulation very objectionable. I think they would say we, of course, have that sovereign right to do that if we think it's appropriate, and would contrast that with what the EU is doing.
Okay, I see. Well, within the European context, we may have this interpretation that the whole regulation is to provide some advantages or some tools for the European market to advance in the competition with US companies. But what about the Brussels effect? And when we see in Latin America, like Brazil, these initiative of regulation would, for instance, Trump administration would interpret this as a movement for Latin American companies to have advantage to compete and attack US companies, because of course the economic context and the industrial context in this digital sector in Latin America and Brazil is completely different from Europe. You may say, well, this is to favor European companies. But will that be interpreted in the same way if, for instance, Brazil would adopt a similar regulation with respect to digital market as Europe did?
I think it will. I think you will. I think the word I would apply to my sense of how the Trump administration would like to see tech regulation implemented is balance. I think the U.S. at this point would like to see a balanced interpretation of tech regulation, whether it's Brazil or the European Union or India or Japan. And balance is absolutely the opposite of what DMA-style regulation does. So I think as we're thinking about, what Brazil might do and how the United States might interpret that, I think some of the kind of DMA-style proposals that have been put forward would absolutely be interpreted in ways as unfairly targeting, unbalanced and unfairly targeting American firms, and frankly, stifling the type of innovation that's beneficial, even if they're American companies, the type of innovation that's beneficial for both Brazil and the United States. So I think this would not be a positive step forward in finding solutions that could benefit both Brazil and the U.S.
Okay, I see. Well, I will leave then a room for Cristiane to pose questions, if you like, Cristiane.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. First, I just want to make one quick comment and bringing back something that Jorge said about who benefits from these regulations. It's very interesting to see that as we are discussing in Brazil a possible regulation for digital markets, we have been reached out by Brazilian companies, South American companies, but also from American companies wanting to benefit from a regulation of this very big platforms. So I completely agree with the point that it's not only at least in Brazil, that we are discussing our own regulation. Of course, we look at what is going on the US and in Europe, but it's interesting to see that we are not only being reached out by Brazilian companies, but also by American companies. They want to benefit from regulation of digital platforms. So one question that I have is more of a practical question, and maybe I'm just curious, but I wanted to, Juliano asked a question about results of the DMA, and I understand that it's quite early to see results yet. But what I'm curious about is, are there any unforeseen outcomes? And I'm looking for really practical things, like there are small companies. I've heard there are small companies, like small restaurants, that are complaining that they're not seen in Google Maps anymore, for example. Have you seen these unforeseen outcomes so far of DMA's enforcement? So this is just a really practical and maybe out of curiosity question.
Yeah, some.
Yeah, I would like to jump in and give another example. For instance, regarding the rule on non-discrimination, there is this effect that was alleged by big techs, that instead of leveling by bringing images of the result, for instance, in Google search engine, in Europe we have we have moved back so that to be non-discriminatory, all the results are just links without images, and that this has not been beneficial to consumers because it hindered innovation. This is another example. So I also would like to hear about it.
So yes, there are some debates about unintended consequences, and it's not entirely surprising because it's the result of the difficulty of regulating ex ante. I'm going to give you another example, and I'm pretty sure that there will be yet others, but one that I think that is actually been quite controversial. and that concerns Google, and it concerns the issue of self-preferencing. And so, in response to the obligations to avoid self-preferencing, Google proposed changes in its algorithm, and I think that it did so in good faith, absolutely, and nobody disputes that, by the way. But I think that the result is that some people felt that the changes were not equally favorable to everybody, or let's put it more concretely, that the changes would facilitate the business of the online trade operators, the OTAs like Booking and Expedia, but that actually were detrimental to the hotels, to the hotel chains and the independent hotels, and so that they would promote competition between Google and these OTAs, but it would actually hamper the competitive position of the hotels. And this is an illustration of something that it shouldn't have been that surprising. The issue is who, and it's related to the point that Christiana made before, who benefits? Actually, there is a range of companies that benefit. Some of them are European, some of them are not European, some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them use a business model, some others use another business model. And the problem that an ex-ante regulation has is that is a little bit like a blanket that you use to cover a small blanket that you use to cover a large bed, and or to cover yourself when you're in a bed. You can cover your feet, but then the head is in the air, or you can cover the head, but then the feet are in the air. And I think that that's part of the problem. One of the things that the Commission is learning, which is that some of the implementation or responses to the actions that it was promoting, like a response to self-preferencing, generate winners and losers. And then you need to think about, is this something that can be fine-tuned? Is this something that the gatekeeper can do, or is a trade-off that is unavoidable? Depending on what is the outcome of the dialogue with the gatekeeper, you're going to have then people complaining and potential ex post actions. And I think that that's very interesting, because it suggests that you need to go back to the drawing board and add new layers of regulation, or possibly conclude that it's never going to rain to the benefit of everybody, or pleasing everybody.
Cesar, do you have any questions?
I was checking the Draghi report, and one of the main claims of the Draghi report was that to close one of the main important objectives for Europe was to close innovation gap with US and China. And the fact is, the problem was the failure to translate innovation in commercialization. And all of these problems rest on restrictive regulation. At the same time, it was in September 2024. And at the same time, we have very recent regulations on DMA, DSA, artificial intelligence. Jorge, do you think Draghi and the Draghi report, these statements, part of it had those sort of regulations in mind, or do you think they just there's a critic against also the recent this strong regulation of this of big techs?
So, I mean, there is no doubt that we have perhaps an excess of regulations in Europe, and that the regulatory burdens that we are imposing on our companies are hurting them and hurting their ability to innovate. I think that there is quite a bit of consensus there. It's taken quite a while to get to that consensus, but I think that we have that consensus. The main problem, however, it seems to be related to regulations that are symmetric rather than those that are asymmetric. The DMA is an asymmetric regulation. There is a question, and Alex and I can debate whether it's asymmetric against US companies or is asymmetric against companies that are successful. I think that is more the latter, to despite of whatever French minister said. But reasonable people can reasonably disagree on that. The regulations that are symmetric, like the GDPR, are clearly negative, especially for small European companies. And there is empirical evidence. There is not too early to say. We have empirical evidence that says that, if anything, GDPR has stopped innovation by the small companies. It has affected negatively everybody, large or small, Europeans or Americans or Chinese, but in particular has had a very detrimental effect on the small companies because the regulatory burden is disproportionate. We suspect, although it is early to say, that the same will apply to the AI Act, that the AI Act is likely to chill innovation in Europe because it imposes disproportionate regulatory costs on companies, and it will have a disproportionate negative effect on small European companies. So we need to simplify regulation. One thing that we need to do, frankly, and the most important thing that Europe could do at this moment, is to try to achieve a scale by implementing properly the single market. You may not know this, but it's easier to trade with the US or with other parts of the world than to trade within the single market in Europe. The regulatory barriers within Europe have been calculated to produce an effect that is similar to the imposition of 45% tariffs on our products. It's almost impossible to trade services across the European Union. Europe has 400 plus million inhabitants, but it cannot leverage that population as America can leverage its 350 million, or China is more than 800 or billion inhabitants. That's where we should focus. Unfortunately, because, and I think that due to reasons that you would all understand, when you create an executive which mainly regulates, well, it's like hiring or buying a hammer that can only hit nails, then it's going to regulate. And I think that we have proliferated in the adoption of regulations instead of using the powers of the European Commission to force the member states to open up their economies and to enforce the single market. And I think that now there is a very strong movement within Europe that says, let's refocus Europe. And let's refocus Europe in order to achieve a single market that effectively works, as opposed to a body that produces legislation about absolutely everything, including things where we cannot make a difference in the world.
Alex, Juliano, could I ask one more question to Alex?
Yes, of course. It's a debate. Be free to.
Okay.
Feel free to ask.
Because Alex, you said that DMA and other regulations in Europe are being considered as non-tariff barriers against U.S. national champions. So that's a new way to protect national champions. It's the trade this trade war with by Trump perhaps could be considered a new frontier of battling to improve the new national champions. Do you think it could some antitrust decisions by Europe, or even regulations like if Brazil enacted, if the Bill of Christianity was successful, passed in the Congress, do you think it perhaps could have the same treatment as the EMEA, like a threat against national champions, or even antitrust decisions, depending on the strength of the antitrust decisions. Like it could be very strong against US big tech. So do you think it's more general, or it's more constrained to DMA or Europe and China, big players?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the question. So the president, I think, in his administration, are looking at trade negotiations as a entry point to have larger discussions about bilateral issues that we have concerns with. And I'll just as an example, the president's talking to Japan about what percentage of Japanese GDP is spent on defense, right? The president's talking to South Korea about the cost of their Korean government spending to sustain US forces on the peninsula. So, I mean, these conversations are much broader than traditional conversations about trade, as maybe you would have seen under Biden or Obama or Bush. That all to be said, I think to my kind of illustrative example of how the president's even briefed on these things, where every time he engages with a world leader, there's the list of bilateral grievances, right, that gets put on his note card. I think he's looking, and this is part of this kind of America first foreign policy, right, where it doesn't matter if it's China or the EU or an American ally or partner. He is looking at the relationship through the context of how are those countries or supranational entities, in the case of the EU, how are they interacting with what he would consider core American interests and equities? And I think, as I tried to lay out in the context with China and the competition, the prosperity and success and innovative success of our tech giants, that is a core American interest as conceived by this administration. So if doesn't matter, I think my bottom line is, it doesn't matter if it's Brazil or it's a country that has a bilateral security treaty with us, like Japan or Korea. It doesn't matter if it's an adversary like China. The bottom line is, if you are crossing into what is seen as this core interest, you're going to get pushback from the administration. What form does that pushback come? I'm sure it's going to be dependent on the situation, but there will be pushback.
I have a question. The drag report, now that Cesar started discussing the drag report makes a diagnosis which is actually clear, that Europe is quite behind in the AI race, particularly with foundational models. And it also says that there is an overlap between the GDPR and the AI Act that should be solved, because this brings difficulties, particularly to small companies and for innovation. And what's actually the position in Europe, or the European authorities and regulators, before this diagnosis of maybe we have excess regulation? Is it that Europe is not pushed forward new regulation like the Data Act, or is it that Europe is going to retreat within some regulations? That means if there is overlap between GDPR and AI Act, is the AI Act, there will be changes within the AI Act? Or I have heard also some in European Commission, some authorities saying that there may be changes even in the GDPR. What do you think there is? I understood now that you are saying that there is a need of harmonization of the GDPR in implementation in the member states, because there are difficulties even within, internally in Europe. But what do you believe? What's the direction of the revision of regulation in Europe?
So I don't think that there is a consensus. I think that there are people, Draghi is a clear-cut example, that believe that we need to reconsider our regulations. And that means reconsidering GDPR, where the body of evidence about its negative effects on our competitiveness are clear. Resigning the AI Act. There is now a very bitter debate about the code of implementation, or the implementation code for the AI Act, and what that means. So you have that opinion, and you have people pushing in that direction. On the other hand, you have people that, for whom I think that what the priority is the protection of the rights of individuals, who believe that, look, I mean, if these regulations have detrimental effects for economic growth, this is the cost that you have to face. Okay, and now personally, I side with Draghi. Personally, I think that we can achieve a balance of protecting the rights of individuals while at the same time making sure that we don't shrink the pie. But there is a bit of debate, and it's unclear in which way we'll proceed. The Commission is engaged in a process of simplification, which means, and they are always, it's very funny how politicians use language. They don't want to call it the regulation. They want to call it simplification. But what is unclear at this stage is how far it will go and how fast. That's very unclear.
Okay, let me ask something to Alex, and maybe you also, Jorge, may jump in. There was last year there was a meeting of the G7, and where it was settled an alliance between Europe and US to develop AI principles for responsible AI, and also joint projects for application of AI, particularly in the environmental protection or climate change. Now, I would like to understand from Alex, if you have information about it, how will this develop within now the Trump directions not to regulate AI and actually to promote the AI market? In this alliance, there was also the idea that later democracies could join in this alliance, and that was a clear indication that China would not be in. So how do you believe that this agreement will develop? Will it be dropped? Will it be pushed forward?
Sure, thank you. So we saw yesterday, and I think it's now clear more this morning in Washington, that the AI diffusion rule that was put out in the waning days of the Obama administration is going to be discarded, and that that's obviously has been a major concern by allies and partners about how is the U.S. tiering and categorizing in some cases some of our closest strategic partners as being untrustworthy for the purposes of transferring key technology. That was, I think, a huge mistake, and fortunately, I think that is being redone in a way that's going to have more of a focus on innovation and collaboration for finding new technologies and new ways to innovate. Look, I would also point you to Vice President Vance's Paris AI Summit speech to give you a sense of how this administration is thinking about AI and innovation. The bottom line is, a number of the things that came out under President Biden we're using a framework that I think is a different framework from the one that this administration is invested in, right? This administration is really invested in the idea that the only way we're going to win the 21st century economically and strategically is innovating at the very edge of these frontier technologies. And that's going to require a regulatory framework, and it's going to require diplomacy with strategic partners and allies that advances that innovative framework. I think a lot of the things, whether it's the diffusion rule or other matters that came out under President Biden, frankly, set us back in the goal of trying to push forward to the very edges and beyond of that frontier framework on new technology, AI being probably the most notable one. We're 110 days into the Trump administration. It's going to take more time to come up with what the details are. You mentioned climate change, you mentioned some other things. It's going to take time to come up with what that is. But I think that as the vice president laid out in Paris in January or February, I think you have at the highest level this belief that all of our regulatory processes and procedures and our kind of overall tax, regulatory, trade structures have to be pointed in the same direction to inculcate an innovative ecosystem that lets us continue to drive the global, we have to be the global driver of AI and other cutting edge technology innovation. And this is all, just to put everything back together, this comes back to the president's concern about foreign targeting. And I take Jorge's point, is it the most successful technology companies or is it American companies? I think at some point, most policymakers in Washington would probably say it's a distinction without a difference. It's the end result is American innovative behemoths are the ones who are being targeted for their success. Therefore, if we want to continue to drive forward in things like AI, we have to put up a real fight when it looks like our champions are being targeted. And so I think this comes full circle back to that same point we've been discussing here today.
Thank you. Jorge, would you like to add something? Okay, so
No.
I have another question for us to debate, which is, well, there was a joint statement, and again, regarding joint initiatives between European authorities and US authorities. There was a joint statement by DOJ, FTC, European Commission, and the CMA at UK regarding AI markets. And this joint statement was concerned with the idea that there was a tendency for big techs to dominate AI markets, dominate foundational models, and therefore AI markets. However, AI markets have not some characteristics that are present in digital markets, like there's no actually network effects as there is in digital markets. Zero marginal costs are not really present, and there is evidence of new companies coming into the competition within digital markets that come from AI, like OpenAI, and now you see Chinese companies like DeepSeek coming with new products which are disrupting, very disruptive. So I would like to make a question and ask for your analysis. Wouldn't it be the other way around? Instead of this prognosis that big techs are going to certainly domain the AI markets, isn't it the other way around? AI markets are bringing mavericks, are bringing new competitors into the landscape that are going to shake positions in digital markets, because you see big techs investing a lot of money to compete in digital market, and this is enhancing competition. They are investing money to compete in AI markets. This is changing competitive pressures in digital markets, indeed. Is it not the other way around that we should consider?
So if I may start, then I would say, look, first, I don't disagree with that proposition, but let's be a little bit more precise. The AI value chain is quite long and very complex. So it starts with the development of certain chips that are used for AI purposes. Ends up, continues with the development of foundational models. It continues with then the development of applications. You need the cloud is also quite relevant. You need compute, and so on and so forth. And different layers of that value chain have different features and different characteristics. And we know that in cloud there is quite a bit of concentration. We actually, in foundational models, contrary to what is being said, I don't think that there is that much concentration, and I think that it is even in dispute what is the right what is the business model, and whether it is large fixed costs, small variable costs, like some of the U.S. companies where or characterize some of the U.S. companies, or the DeepSeek situation, which is the opposite: high marginal costs, low fixed costs. So it's very early, and I think that the most important thing is we have to be cautious before intervening. And my sense is that, contrary to the consensus that you referred to, which I think that was a consensus of a couple of years ago, things have moved, and not only in the US. Also, you have seen movement in the UK, the CMA becoming more cautious in the way it thinks about intervention in antitrust intervention, especially in high-tech markets. And my sense is that the European Commission is also being very cautious. At the same time, let me tell you that of course, there are a number of commercial battles in each and every one of those layers of the value chain, and there are companies that feel that others are misbehaving, and they go and complain to the various authorities. And once again, so that we are all on the same page here, the complainants are not, carrying a flag against another flag. The complaints, for example, against the cloud triopoly that you hear in Brussels come from the US, and so on. So the authorities, whether they are US authorities or European authorities or authorities in any other part of the world, need to be cautious. The technology is evolving. The way in which these technologies are monetized are evolving. And one has to understand that there are winners and losers, and one has to remember as well that the goal of the antitrust laws is to protect competition, not competitors, wherever they are based. And I think that, therefore, I would urge caution at this stage, especially because I agree that in what are the new layers of the value chain, many of the characteristics of the big tech platforms are not in existence. And we cannot simply think that because AI is high tech, that means that the AI markets are going to behave identically as the platform markets that have raised so many concerns over the last few years.
Thank you, Alex. So regarding this point, is there any movement in the Trump administration regarding this statement by FTC and DOJ? It's against big techs, because it signals that big techs will dominate AI market, and this will be a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is because of the unique nature of some of these technologies and the capital-heavy expenditures that are required to lead in innovation. And I would point out, when you think about DeepSeek and you think about some of the frontier technologies that are coming out of China, that is all government-sponsored research and development dollars. This is the Chinese Communist Party pushing national champions to a degree. When I speak of national champions, I'm speaking of it informally, and I'm speaking of it in the kind of dotted line. From a Chinese perspective, these are either state-owned enterprises or they are enterprises with a direct government sponsorship of some kind. That makes it very difficult to compete in terms of R&D dollars and in terms of the innovation ecosystem. The only way at this point in the development of these technologies that we're going to be able to do that kind of competition is to leverage the capabilities of our existing big tech firms who are putting unbelievably large amounts of research dollars into innovating every single day. You look at OpenAI, and where OpenAI came from. OpenAI was a project of existing big tech firms like Microsoft, right? So, we have this kind of unique moment where the current entrants in the market are providing the innovation dollars that are leading, I would argue, that are leading to the potential for new entrants to come in over time. But the unique nature of this technology development cycle is making it so that we really cannot afford, because of the high cost of the barriers of entry, the high costs of entry. At this point, we just cannot, we can't go to a model where we expect new entrants to drive innovation. We want to encourage those new entrants, but those new entrants are going to come into the market only following along in the development process behind the big tech firms who have the capacity to drive that innovation today.
Great, Alex. Very interesting, really. I believe we've had a very enlightening discussion with several inputs for us to reflect upon, considering the Brazilian context and what are the best Brazilian directions and position, both strategically, in particular regarding regulation. I would like to know if Cristiano and Cesar have any other questions to discuss.
No, not from my side. Thank you, Juliano.
Okay, so I leave to maybe some last statements by Jorge and Alex regarding some recommendations for the Brazilian policy, and just to close our meeting.
Yeah, from the European perspective, what I would say is that it is important that you focus on what is important for Brazil. I think that each country, each union has its own priorities. And the choice of instruments, as I mentioned during my presentation in Europe, was driven by the peculiarities of our institutional framework. So ex-ante regulation was not seen as the optimal approach for many of us. We thought of something else. And it was because of our institutional framework that we ended up where we ended up. I think that you have to do what you think that it fits your economy and your needs. And I think that if anything, see and look at what is happening in Europe as with the benefit of the benefit of a experiment that can help you understand what's right and what's wrong, and how to avoid some of the mistakes and take advantage of some of the positive developments.
Thank you, Jorge. Alex?
Thank you for the opportunity to share the U.S. perspective, and it's great to be with Jorge, who clearly is incredibly knowledgeable about these issues. So I've learned a lot from him. I think my parting thought would simply be that this word balance really is, I think, from an American perspective, that's what we're focused on. And Jorge's point is well taken, that every country has to take regulatory and competition steps from their standpoint, their domestic and their cultural standpoint. And I think that there is a level of understanding of that in Washington. But obviously in every country, we have to prioritize our interests and where we are geopolitically and domestically. As we're thinking about how we interact with the Brazilian government, I think what you will hear from American interlocutors is a request for balance, a request that regulation, contrary to how it was done in Europe for the reasons Jorge laid out, I think our request would simply be that there be a balance of equities between a environment in which American tech is seen as whether it's because it's the most successful or because it's American, whatever the reason, that it be seen as something to be singled out, or I think we want to see a regime among our partners that balances out your concerns about size and scale with an appreciation that we are driving innovation, and that I think the United States wants to have a conversation constructively about how do we balance some of your domestic concerns with our overarching concern that we not see our champion companies hobbled in a way that would put us, frankly, from a domestic perspective, that would put us in a place we don't want to be, and two, that would impede our ability to drive innovation that will allow us to remain globally competitive in the China context, which, as I said, and I can't say this enough, if you want to understand how Americans are thinking about pretty much everything from a public policy perspective today, it is in the context of China as an existential threat to us. So thinking about how tech policy plays into our U.S.-China competition, I think that'll give you a good sense of why we want balance in the approach of Brazil and others to our tech companies. So thank you again, and I really appreciate the chance to do this.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm very happy with these with the results of this meeting. I'm sure that it has have produced very important inputs. So this is an asset for Brazilian stakeholders to continue discussing it. We are going, as I said, to organize an in-person meeting in Brasilia to gathering these important stakeholders, both from the academy and also authorities who are discussing this issue in Brazil. And this content surely will be very important for us to debate. So thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Jorge, Cristiane, and Cesar, for your contributions today. And so thank you very much. And so I say to the audience to keep following our debates and to be present in our next meeting, which will be in person in Brasilia. We are going to announce when it's completely defined. And just thank you very much. This was really a very stimulating debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.